a 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with a weathered Slavic face, pale cold-weather skin, deep eye lines, short dark hair touched with grey, tired observant eyes, wearing a 1974 Soviet KGB captain uniform beneath a heavy dark wool overcoat, standing rigidly in a dim underground corridor beneath Red Square, emotionally controlled but subtly disturbed. Cold concrete and steel walls disappear into darkness. Weak fluorescent lights flicker overhead, breath condensation visible in the air. Frost gathers around pipes and sealed doors. Cinematic medium shot, shallow depth of field, handheld documentary framing, natural film grain, high-budget Russian psychological horror detective film, still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with sharp Slavic facial structure, pale skin, tired eyes, and slight forehead lines, wearing a Soviet KGB captain uniform with rolled sleeves and worn leather gloves, standing beside 27-year-old Major Valery Sidov, a younger Russian man with short blonde hair and hopeful eyes, both staring in silent unease at a massive 3-meter copper sphere suspended with a cloudy quartz crystal inside. Golden waveguides snake across the floor toward black monolithic structures under dim state fluorescent lighting. Soviet underground laboratory walls gleam with cold moisture, dust hangs in stagnant air, and unnatural silence swallows every sound. Wide cinematic shot with anamorphic composition, 35mm film look, natural grain, realistic psychological horror detective film still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with exhausted Slavic features, pale skin, deepening stress lines, and cold, watchful eyes, wearing a slightly disheveled Soviet KGB captain uniform beneath a dark wool coat, frozen in front of an operator console as every clock around him reads exactly 03 o'clock. His expression is subtle shock, mixed with growing dread. Electronic displays and old Soviet wall clocks stand motionless under weak flickering fluorescent lights. Green instrument panels cast dim reflections across steel walls, while an unnatural silence hangs over the underground sector. Behind him, shadows stretch too long across damp corridors and sealed blast doors. Cinematic over-the-shoulder shot, shallow depth of field, surveillance-style framing, 35mm film texture with natural grain, realistic psychological horror detective film still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with pale weathered skin, tired eyes darkened by sleeplessness, short graying hair and a tense jaw, wearing a Soviet KGB captain uniform under a heavy wool coat, standing beside 27-year-old Major Valery Sidov as both stare in disturbed disbelief at an oscilloscope screen, drawing a complex fractal symbol by itself. Alexei's expression is restrained fear and suspicion, while Sidov's face shows fascinated unease. The underground Soviet control room is lit by dim green instrument glow and weak fluorescent lighting. Condensation clings to steel walls, old panels hum softly, and a low invisible vibration seems to press against the air itself. Cinematic medium shot from behind the glowing monitor, shallow depth of field, natural film grain, cold blue-gray tones, high-budget Russian psychological horror detective film still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with a rugged Slavic face, pale winter skin, tired eyes, and deepening anxiety lines, wearing a Soviet KGB captain uniform beneath a dark military coat, cautiously descending beside 27-year-old Major Valery Sidov and Professor Konstantin Orlov through an ancient underground stone passage beneath Moscow. Alexei grips a heavy Soviet flashlight tightly, his expression controlled but increasingly disturbed. Orlov, a tall, gaunt Russian man around 60 with unnaturally intense eyes and predatory posture, walks ahead with quiet obsession. The tunnel walls are rough stone covered with moisture, mold, and centuries of decay. Cold mist clings low to the ground, and weak flashlight beams vanish into endless darkness. Cinematic wide-shot, handheld documentary framing, 35mm film look, deep shadows with shallow depth of field, natural film grain, realistic psychological horror, detective film still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with a weathered Slavic face, pale skin, tired eyes widened by primal fear and short dark hair streaked with grey, wearing a Soviet KGB captain uniform under a damp wool coat, standing frozen beside 27-year-old Major Valery Sidov as both stare at a colossal black monolith rising from an ancient underground chamber. Professor Konstantin Orlov, a tall, gaunt Russian man with burning eyes and fanatical intensity, stands near the stone with reverent fascination. Strange carved symbols glow faint green across the smooth, alien surface, casting weak, pulsing light over uneven stone floors and cave walls disappearing into darkness. Cold vapor hangs in the air, moisture glistens on rock surfaces, and a low, unseen vibration seems to press through their bones. Cinematic, wide, low-angle shot, anamorphic composition, natural film grain, shallow depth of field, ultra-realistic, high-budget Russian psychological horror detective film, still. A 27-year-old Russian man, Major Valery Sidov, with pale skin, short blonde hair, youthful Slavic features now drained of color, wearing a Soviet officer uniform with loosened collar and trembling hands, standing before the black monolith as his fingertips touch glowing symbols on its surface. His expression is frozen between wonder and sudden terror, eyes wide as if hearing impossible voices. Beside him, 42-year-old Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov lunges forward in panic, reaching toward him too late, while Professor Konstantin Orlov stands behind them with a chilling expression of religious ecstasy. Ancient symbols erupt into blinding green light, harsh shadows explode across wet stone walls, dust and vapor swirl through the chamber, and absolute unnatural silence fills the air. Cinematic close-up with dynamic handheld framing, shallow depth of field, 35mm film texture, natural film grain, realistic psychological horror detective film still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with a worn Slavic face, pale skin, sleepless eyes, and growing emotional exhaustion, wearing a Soviet KGB captain uniform with the collar slightly undone, standing over 27-year-old Major Valery Sidov in a cramped Soviet medical room deep underground. Sidov lies on a narrow metal cot with cold sweat on his face, staring blankly toward the ceiling while silently moving his lips, his expression empty and disconnected. Alexei leans forward with quiet dread and protective concern. Weak hospital lighting flickers overhead, peeling paint and rusted cabinets line the walls. Old medical instruments cast long shadows, breath condensation hangs in the damp air, and the oppressive underground silence feels alive. Cinematic medium shot from Alexei's perspective, shallow depth of field, soft handheld framing, natural film grain, realistic psychological horror detective film still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with pale skin, exhausted eyes ringed by sleepless shadows, deep forehead lines and a rigid expression hiding fear, wearing a Soviet KGB captain uniform under dim emergency lighting, standing alone inside the central laboratory at night. He stares downward at a small pool of strange, dark, oily liquid beneath the massive copper sphere, his face tense with growing paranoia. The liquid reflects impossible shifting rainbow colors and subtly changes shape on its own. Around him, the Soviet underground chamber is nearly empty. Emergency lights cast weak red and green glows through drifting dust. Long, distorted shadows stretch unnaturally across steel walls, and something unseen seems to move in the edges of darkness. Cinematic low-angle shot, surveillance-style framing, shallow depth of field, 35mm film texture with natural grain, realistic psychological horror detective film still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with a gaunt Slavic face, pale skin, tired, fearful eyes, and disheveled short hair streaked with gray, sitting upright in a narrow Soviet sleeping quarters, wearing an unbuttoned undershirt beneath his KGB uniform, frozen in absolute terror. Standing beside his bed is 27-year-old Major Valery Sidov, unnaturally rigid in a Soviet officer uniform, his posture perfectly straight and inhumanly still. His face wears an impossibly wide smile, eyes swallowed by cold black emptiness, his expression neither human nor emotional. Weak yellow night lighting barely illuminates cracked walls and old furniture, while shadows pool heavily in corners. Cigarette smoke and damp air linger in the room, and the silence feels suffocating. Cinematic close-up from Alexei's bedside perspective, shallow depth of field, natural film grain, psychological handheld framing, realistic psychological horror detective film, Still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with exhausted Slavic features, pale skin, trembling eyes, and deep emotional strain carved into his face, wearing a wrinkled Soviet KGB captain uniform with a hidden sidearm beneath his coat, sitting alone in a dark surveillance room, staring at a grainy black-and-white monitor. His expression is controlled panic and disbelief. On the screen appears technician Shilov, a young Russian man whose face is caught mid-distortion, human features stretched unnaturally into a thin, insect-like shape, with hollow black eyes and a narrow, impossible smile. The control room is lit only by cold monitor glow and weak green instrument lights. Dust hangs in stale underground air, and shadows from old Soviet equipment swallow the corners of the room. Cinematic over-the-shoulder shot, surveillance-style framing, shallow depth of field, 35mm film texture with natural grain, realistic psychological horror detective film Still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with a weathered Slavic face, pale skin, bruised throat marks, sweat-soaked hair, and desperate, exhausted eyes, wearing a damaged Soviet KGB captain uniform with torn sleeves, running beside elderly engineer Kravchenko through a Soviet underground tunnel toward reactor access doors. Alexei grips a Soviet service pistol while looking back in terror. Behind them, distorted human figures move with unnatural synchronized precision through flashing red emergency lights. The corridor walls ripple subtly as reality bends. Green light leaks from cracks in concrete. Shadows stretch into impossible forms, and sirens echo through cold industrial air. Cinematic handheld action framing, wide anamorphic composition, natural film grain, shallow depth of field, ultra-realistic Russian psychological horror detective film Still. A 42-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with a battered Slavic face, pale skin covered in sweat and dust, blood at the corner of his mouth and eyes filled with grief and determination, wearing a torn Soviet KGB captain uniform, standing inside a reactor control chamber flooded with violent green light. Before him towers the transformed form of 27-year-old Major Valery Sidov, now a horrifying elongated humanoid with stretched limbs and distorted remnants of his former Russian features still faintly visible beneath the nightmare. In a brief moment of human return, sorrow and rage flicker in Sidov's eyes as he turns toward Professor Konstantin Orlov, a gaunt, elderly Russian man holding a black journal with fanatic terror on his face. The chamber vibrates with static energy. Steel panels bend under pressure, cables spark overhead, and the air glows with impossible light. Cinematic low-angle wide shot, shallow depth of field, 35mm film look with natural grain, realistic psychological horror detective film Still. A 92-year-old Russian man, Alexei Ivanovich Sokolov, with deeply weathered Slavic features, pale skin, thin grey hair, trembling hands and tired eyes, carrying decades of fear, wearing an old worn wool sweater and modest Soviet-era houseclothes, standing alone beside a window in a small Moscow apartment at night with a haunted, reflective expression. Outside, distant city lights blur through winter fog while snow drifts across aging apartment blocks. A silent television casts weak blue light across cracked wallpaper and faded Soviet furniture. Alexei stares at his dark window reflection where, for a fraction of a moment, a subtle, distorted, non-human face seems to overlap his own. Breath condensation clouds the cold glass, the room feels suffocatingly still, and invisible dread lingers in the silence. Cinematic close-up with shallow depth of field, soft handheld framing, natural film grain, emotionally haunting final frame from a high-budget Russian psychological horror detective film Still.